Hello and welcome to Gender Day at COP26. And just as a demonstration of how powerful the energy sisterhood is, those of you tuning in expecting a solitary speech from me, congratulations to all of you. There won't be a solitary speech from me. Instead, I have good news. I'm joined by a panel of women I've called in essentially at the last minute to talk about gender and the energy transition and climate change much more broadly than I could manage on my own, and crucially, probably more coherently at day 10 of the COP. So I'm going to introduce everyone and then we're going to have hopefully a really interesting discussion spanning everything that we're talking to here at the COP. So I'm going to go to my left. Tanya Kumar, who's Head of Decarbonisation, Big Brief at the CBI. Rebecca Williams, who's Director of COP26, another fancy job title, at GWEC, which is the Global Wind Energy Council. I'm Emma Pinchbeck, I'm the Chief Executive of Energy UK. And then to my right, I've got Kate Norsgrove. Yes, good. Who's at, I'm struggling to pronounce my own name at this point in the COP, who's the Executive Director of Advocacy and Campaigns at WWF. And just to disclose interest, I have worked with Rebecca and we've both worked for WWF. So there's a nice, there's some nice personal perspectives about what we've seen in the movement, I'm sure, to come. And so, look, what I would have talked about if I'd been talking to industry off my own bat is gender through two frames. The first, and one that's probably unfamiliar to a lot of you if you're dialing in from the energy sector, is the impact on particularly women and girls and other vulnerable groups of climate change itself, and why therefore it's so important to include their voices in the COP and in the climate movement in general. And we're going to talk a little bit about that to you all. But then the second frame we want to talk to is the energy transition, and certainly the work that we need to do to build the future workforce and the skills for that workforce and include diverse perspectives as we shift the global economy away from fossil fuels and into clean technologies. And we'll try and cover all of that as briefly and humorously as possible. So challenge to everyone
no pressure.
Here. Yeah, and let's start with and we might actually tell some personal stories and try not to have a cathartic rant whilst we do it. But let's start with this. It's a big day at COP, and as I've said, that brief is huge, right? So when you guys are thinking about gender and how you've seen it and experienced it, or diversity more broadly in your work, what kind of comes through to you first? And not just like, isn't it great to have microphones that you can clip onto clothes because they don't make pockets in women's clothing? Maybe something more profound than that. Let's go this way first. Tanya.
Wow, huge question.
Yeah, big question.
To start off with, I think the one thing that's struck me as someone as a representative across the whole of the business community, not just over the energy transition, is just the importance of representation really matters, because we're talking about something that's systemically happening to humankind, and therefore businesses need to be representing the views of the whole of the economy, different people from different parts of society. But also what struck me personally, I'm a British Indian, the negotiations that are happening, the solutions that we're driving, not only just across the UK, but also globally, need to fit all of those different communities internationally. Personally, I've actually been really struck and excited. This is our first COP as the CBI, my first COP. And to go inside the blue and green zones, it's been so dynamic to see so many different people represent at COP. However, there's lots of people that aren't here, and it just saddens me that their voices can't be heard.
Yeah.
So that's what worries me the most, that some of the solutions that we might come out with aren't actually those that everyone can adopt. And I'm sure we're going to touch on some of those together. But that's really important, because we can't be reaching net zero if we're not understanding the communities that actually have to live with these consequences, but also adapt the solutions. And we'll touch on it as well, but the just transition, what does that actually mean?
Yeah.
How do we go from sort of this technical terminology to actually just what we're seeing outside today? The weather, we can all relate to that. You don't need to have any amount of money or, fancy words. So that's one thing that's really struck me. But is it being reflected in everything that we're doing? I'm a little bit less confident about that.
Yeah, I don't know what it says about the energy industry that, if we're having very frank discussions, I arrived and went to the Blue Zone, and I think we might talk a little bit about moving back from the NGO movement to the private sector. But I was in the Blue Zone yesterday, and it was great to see so many people of colour and so many different people in a very different demographic, like just walking around, and to see that and feel, oh, this is, you know, brilliantly inclusive. But then you see what people are saying about the lack of inclusion, and you think, wow, it's terrifying that as an industry I was like, oh, this actually looks better than what I experience day to day, but it's still not good enough, and just how far therefore we've probably got to go, certainly in industry, before we've got we're truly kind of including all those different voices. And let's pick up on the just transition and why that matters. I can have a rant about infrastructure design. Becca, what about you? Yeah.
So we've, as GWEC, been in the Blue Zone the whole week, and we've been meeting with many different party delegations. So we've been having some really interesting conversations there with major kind of coal to clean nations like South Africa, Vietnam, and those conversations have been, from a climate change perspective, really inspiring and exciting. We're seeing real progress being driven by NDCs, I think, for the first time. We've actually got parties coming up to us and saying, okay, we've got an ambitious NDC. We've got, in some cases, specific renewables targets. How can we get there? Can you help us? And of course, we're saying, yes, we can help you. So that's been really inspiring, and I've really enjoyed seeing that. What has not been quite so inspiring, I would say, is that the huge majority of the people we have met with have been men.
Right.
And, you know, this is Gender Day, so I think we do need to focus in on that. We have lots of different stats to show how powerful it is, not only to tackle climate change because it adversely impacts women, but also because women are, as we all know, the major kind of purchasers of products and services in the world today. And we should also remember that women are not minorities.
Yeah.
We are half of the population.
Yeah.
So we should be represented as such. And the thing that does make me quite sad, and that I think we do need to find a better answer to come to Tanya's point about representation, well, you know, women are not at these tables. They're not the ones making the decisions, and they're not our elected officials yet. So for me, that's a huge issue that somehow we do need to fix at the same time as tackling the climate crisis. And maybe we can come on to this in a bit more detail, but I think, as is with the climate crisis, we do need systemic change here, and that will mean some tough decisions in terms of representation and in terms of how we fix this problem.
Yeah, so much to ask you. It was, you said that apparently a third of the delegations at COP, there's only 30% of the delegations at COP are women, and you're right, and we should talk about intersectionality, because we tend to talk about like just gender as if it's a minority issue, but you're right, it's like women, and then within that the kind of huge range of perspectives and experiences that massive demographic block means, and we never get further than women, and we treat us as a minority group because that's how it looks in rooms like this one. Okay, I mean, the pandas are a huge international network, and the rollout at COPs is always spectacular. But I wonder what you think about the, you know, both in terms of the impacts of climate change on women and girls and vulnerable groups, but also, you know, whether you see this problem play out in the climate movement in general about inclusion of voices.
Yeah, certainly. And I think when you do have women in the room, and actually in the NGO sector there are a lot more women than men, they're often white women, and so there is a big problem with lack of diversity and representation in the environmental sort of NGO civil society movement, particularly in the UK. I don't know about other countries, but actually meeting international colleagues and seeing and feeling how much more diverse it is has really helped with my understanding about what it means to be from WWF, which is truly an international organisation, not just a white British women organisation, being totally representative of that group. And I think the reason this is important, I used to work at Oxfam, actually, another NGO based in West Africa, in Senegal, and I'll never forget the feeling of spending time with women in refugee camps in eastern Chad, who back in 2007, when I was there, were obviously affected by climate change and the disappearance of Lake Chad, and being on the border with Darfur with these women was just, it was just amazing, the resilience and strength within which they were facing these challenges, having to walk for miles for water before they reached the refugee camp, and then actually at the refugee camp, the risks and challenges of that. And that war in Darfur and still the ongoing instability in that region is very much caused by climate change. So it's women who are affected first, and worst. I mean, just another example, in India, 80% of women in India who are of employable age are employed in the agriculture and food sectors. And so it's land and that sort of industry that's going to be very much affected by climate change. So those people are. And one last thing, which is to say just how important this is. I think one thing I've noticed from my own experience, because actually that's the only thing I really know about, is you get into a room with lots of men to talk about climate change, the answer is always about technology.
Yeah.
It's always technology. What we need to do is get out an engine and fix this thing. And I'm talking to a bunch of energy people, so
No,
I'm not sure.
Like,
But actually the problem is so often much more about systems and the way that people work together.
Yeah.
And in the end, the challenge is there. So you have all of these innovation prizes, for example, to tackle climate change. It's just like, get over it. It's just about people, right? It's just about how people work together.
Yeah.
And I don't want to sort of, I mean, I just think women have a lot to add in that space. Let's put it that way.
This is the kind of thing that will get me into trouble, but you know, why not? It's day 10. But I have been struck by how many middle-aged white blokes who are billionaires who've come quite late to the climate party and whose solutions to it are all technology, always, and quite often things like negative emissions technology, and they're coming at it from a prism of, you know, being very invested in the economic model, which I can completely understand if it's benefited you, you know, like if you're really invested in that world, why would you see the need for change? But and so you get to a place where you can't possibly imagine a different system, and therefore where the solutions have to be plugged into the existing system or eventually correct for it, like, you know, wholly relying on something like DAX and negative emissions. And like, for anyone that has seen the fallibility of that system, and I talk to this with young people all the time, you know, like young people are annoyed about climate change, but they're also annoyed about like not being able to afford a house, and they're not having children because of the wider economy not benefiting them in the same way. And so if you have a different perspective, you come up with different solutions. But that's on my list of pet hates. I think I've ranted about that on Twitter, so I think I'm probably fine to cover that here. I can see you guys nodding along, like about, you know, the system or technologist approaches.
Well, you know, I think we have the tools and technology to tackle climate change, and we've had them for a while. Also, if you look back, we've known the science has been clear on this for a long period of time. I mean, I recently found an article which showed that we knew that burning coal causes man-made climate change as far back as 1890. Yeah. And, you know, we have had renewable technologies now for some years. We're still a young industry compared to others, and we're still disruptive, but we definitely have the tools. So if we have the tools, coming back to your point, Kate, why haven't we solved this problem yet? And it is the systemic issue around people that we're really not getting to the heart of yet. So I do think, you know, technology-wise, we shouldn't be focusing out on silver bullets that are all going to save us down from space or somewhere. Yeah. We should be focusing in on what we can control with the tools that we have.
Yeah, I think that people element, you know, the big question that everyone's asking, you know, what's going on inside there? And you're trying to explain, you know, this is what's being negotiated, etc. But at the end of the day, people are at the heart of this. And that's why having that diversity of thought, that representation to also come into the room and say, okay, taking this to the real world economy, this might not work because this has been a little bit of groupthink, right? Yeah. Like the biggest, you know, the biggest hurdle now is we've got all of these solutions. Some are going to cost, some are going to change behaviours, and that's the element where people being at the heart of the transition or achieving net zero is really important. Yeah. And that's where the discussions around engagement with civil society is so important, that you actually need a lot more time, dare I say, if you had another week of COP to get more of that engagement, right? And it's especially with the youth as well. I was reflecting at the CBI that actually I will be here in 2050. So this is my career span. Yeah. And that's the other thing of young business leaders I've seen sort of very far and few between. So I've been that awkward one in the catering hall, just going up to other young delegates, saying, you know, tell me, what do you think our generation should be doing? Because that's the longevity. 2050 is so hard for everyone to fathom as well. 2030, we keep on talking about that, but when you're listening to communities, it's happening now. Right now. And if I reflect on family that are in different parts of the world, they can relate to that. It's land and nature.
Yeah.
And I think some of the best speeches inside the plenary halls have been, you know what, you don't need to go to X university to have a PhD in this, actually. You don't need to reduce anything to a model as well. And that's where, to geek out on economic models, one of the biggest issues that we're facing now is that we try to reduce all of our systems into a very pure economic model. It needs to be very binary. We need to be able to price things. We need it to have a cost and a benefit. But in that, you've lost the cost to humanity.
Yeah, it's a wider values conversation.
Yeah, the wider values, the value of nature, the value of health, really topical the last few years. Where is that intersectionality between that?
Yeah.
So I think that's another huge reflection that I'd like to see sort of coming out of COP as well. It's not going to happen overnight.
No.
But it's interesting between those people who are in the room.
I thought you were going to stop it. It's not going to happen. And I was like, no, wait, it can.
It can definitely happen. It won't happen overnight. But just reflecting what everyone's saying, I think that's a really interesting point, that nature and, you know, everything around the energy transition is telling us, you know, don't try and reduce it all to model, but we're just inherently doing that because of the lack of diversity of thought.
And I think coming back to it, so that, you know, you've reminded me of a couple of things I've thought with diversity lately. So a few stories about the economic model, and perhaps we can get into values more broadly, but when we were at WWF, the thing that I loved about the climate work is often what we call co-benefits in economic terms, but the fact that if you solve decarbonisation or you're helping to mitigate climate change or you're investing in adaptation projects, there were often co-benefits, and because climate change impacts women and vulnerable groups, that's where those impacts are. And the example I'm thinking of is we had a clean cook stoves project back in Nepal, run by the Global Programs team when I was at the Pandas, and the switch over to clean cook stoves effectively meant that women and girls who were responsible for running the household and household energy were no longer going as far or at all to collect wood, which then meant that there was a massive uptick in the education rate for the girls in those communities. And so, you know, often tackling climate change has this systemic wider benefit. And so I think about that. And I also think about wider values. So I've got a little girl. I talk about her a lot. Alienates quite a lot of people on Twitter, but they're probably not my core audience. And the reason I talk to her is it does change how you view and experience the world. So 2 examples from that when I think about my job, which is infrastructure. The first is I had no idea how much of our infrastructure had been designed around getting what was historically blokes into the office from the suburbs of cities until I had a pram that was trying to get around the suburbs in the day to see other people who were around in the day, and often that's women or older people or people who are much more located in their community. It's just almost impossible. There's no way of doing it. It was really, really challenging. And that's because we designed infrastructure around a particular user group who were in the room and running the economy at the time. So that's one. And the second thing is about values and climate change. We've been talking about heat decarbonisation in the UK a lot, but I have found that the thing that moves people that are not brought in necessarily is the question of air quality for their kids. And particularly there's a really, really, really leery protest group called Mums for Lungs who are driving a lot of the low traffic neighbourhood conversation and the traffic pollution conversation in the UK, but also indoor air quality. And if I'd been thinking about it with my own house, I think understanding that my boiler was a source of NOx emissions that might be a risk to my little girl would have moved me just as much as all of the stuff that I know about climate change and all the stuff I know about energy economics. And I think we have these very narrow, as you said, Tanya, conversations.
And those women in Nepal that you were talking about will also have been benefited by better air quality as a result. So that's the other co-benefit. There, but no, I know Mums for Lungs. They're absolutely amazing.
Terrifying.
Terrifying, but also, and there's also an amazing group called Choked Up,
who
have done fantastic guerrilla posters and have played a massive role in getting ULEZ, which is the low air emission zone in London, expanded to reach the North and South Circular, which is going to make a massive difference to air pollution in the capital, because it has in the centre as well. And
then, I mean, just lastly, let's come back, there's that quote I saw, there's a really good Guardian article this week from the Indigenous groups at COP who were talking about, and I'm a big fan of the private sector. I think we've leaned into that as career choices in some ways because we see the change happening there, and it's exciting and transformational. So this is like not knocking what we can achieve in the current economic model. But they were talking, the Indigenous groups were talking about natural capital accounting.
Yeah.
And there's that line about, you know, for us, it's not a line on a spreadsheet. For those groups, it's like our land, it's our home, and it's got a spiritual value that is not captured in these conversations. And it really got to me, you know, and I think, again, another need to have different points of view.
But that's kind of the same as with women in general, right? You know, we often talk about the economic value of having women in the boardroom, or the economic value that can be placed on a change in decision making due to women or other minorities being present at the table.
Yeah.
But actually,
Yeah.
is that the right approach? Should we be ascribing that economic value to this thing which is a basic point of humanity rather than just, you know, but spreadsheetizing everything?
I'm hearing strong tear down the system vibes from you today.
I think, well, my kind of stump speech for the day is really about systemic change, because I think, and I was just actually on a panel somewhere else in Glasgow, but there was a lot of talk about, well, what can women do? You know, what can minorities do? Shouldn't we lean in? Shouldn't we be braver? Shouldn't we pull back? And I'm just really bored of that. I think, you know, with climate change, yes, we can all take individual actions that would improve our daily lives in many ways. You know, we can all take decisions to use public transport, or to walk, or to cycle. But really, how much change is that going to make? We need the guys over there in the blue zone to really pull their fingers out, right? So that's why I just think, for me, it does come back to systemic change. And I think, like with climate change, we only have a certain amount of time for us to tackle this problem, because we're tackling the climate crisis, we're tackling the biodiversity crisis, and that will come with new structures and new ways of doing things. If we don't tackle this gender and diversity crisis at the same time, we're probably just going to be locked in with structures that, the same exactly, lock ourselves in with outdated kind of social infrastructure again, I guess.
And that's the point, you know, as with everything around diversity. So it's, it won't come as a surprise. Obviously, it's very rare, like you said, to get people from ethnic minorities joining the field of infrastructure. So when you find yourself in that position, like myself, it's an additional responsibility, but it's also a joy to have to actually build the next pipeline of those who are looking at careers as well. So that's the other thing, where you can't just have one day. You know, the saying always goes, you can't just focus diversity on one day. It would have been, you know, it's great to include it throughout. It should actually be systemically throughout any programme that you have, and interwoven. The fact that you then sort of pull it away, there is some criticism on that. But when we've seen around, sort of reporting has been really actually crucial to look at in the private sector in terms of boardrooms, that, you know, starting from a data point is mobilising action to get people in the room. I think that is the one way that actually you can overcome it, quite visibly as well. So I think in terms of when we look at the business community, you know, you've got the 30% club for women, boardroom level, but we also at the CBI have been developing something called Change the Race ratio as well, in terms of looking how, you know, it's not only having those people at C-suite level, it's about the pipeline, because you don't just solve it by just parachuting someone in.
Yes.
And when you're talking about sort of the sustainability of the economy, of your business as well, it's actually understanding and reflecting the society, the consumers of tomorrow. We have to reflect that in ourselves, because we are all, you know, purchasers of those goods and services. So there is a huge way to go. And when we talk about diversity and representation, it's not obviously just ethnicity is so diverse in itself. You can't just pigeonhole it into certain categories, and that's really difficult. It's a whole blend, and like you say, you know, everyone can only speak from their personal experience as well, and that's so different. But that's why you need all of those voices in that room. No one's saying that we can engineer a solution for everyone. But the bottom line is, at the moment, we're just engineering it for one subset, small subset of people.
I'm sorry for anyone watching this who feels like we're knocking your particular demographic. It's not. I was wondering about what you think the solutions are. So we've talked about, you know, tokenism doesn't work, but we've also talked about you do need to improve the bodies in the room. So you need to get people in. But it sounds like what you're saying is it's not enough just to have people in our world in the boardrooms, or have people in the movement, or have people in the negotiations. We've also got to give them space or listen to values better. And I
was just going to say that. I think it's as much about, I think people who can ask good questions and then listen to the answers properly are in short supply. And I think building up skills in that area as we grow as a sector and as a society is going to be ever more crucial, particularly with AI, those empathetic and listening skills, which should not be characterised to one gender or another, but are true everywhere and whatever gender race you are extremely important and are going to become more important if we're going to tackle this crisis. I've been thinking a lot about green careers actually. We're about to start a programme at WWF UK, not about green careers in our sector, but actually green careers everywhere and what green careers means. Because actually, if I was starting my career again now, I might not go into the charity sector at all. I'd be going into banks. I'd actually love to work for HSBC. I'd love to go and work and be in there. I mean, that's trillions of dollars you can move if you're in the right place. And actually, companies like that, I mean, McDonald's, that's another one. You know, they're just on the cusp of starting to do a bit more. And I would want to be working with them to say, look, how can we change this? I want to be a leader in this sector, in this industry. And that's where you're going to have the most impact. Yeah. So I think that that's something to think about in the future. Yeah, that's certainly how that's how we ended up moving from the NGO world back into the private sector. And for all that we've talked about needing to change the model, absolutely no regrets on that score in terms of the pace. But I was going to say on a kind of personal level on values, I think, and how you enable that, it's got to be through allyship. So when I think about diversity and inclusion, and certainly how we improve it, there's some structural stuff. I completely agree, measuring targets, setting quotas, and actually I quite like really hard, like just get representation, improve quotas. And the reason is, when I started my career, I remember a lot of people talking to me about soft stuff like mentoring. You know, talent identification and mentoring, and we'll kind of bring you through and we'll find people like you. We'll just give you a mentor, go away and talk to a mentor and don't come into us in the boardroom. And 10 years later, classic. Like when I was thinking about some of the grads that worked for me, I really didn't want to tell them the same thing because it changed a bit, but not hugely. So I think they're completely within their rights to be like, just that quotas. So I'm not knocking the system. The other thing though, I think is a lot of it is either is enabling policies and behaviours. So actually the thing that has made a massive difference to me being able to take this job at this time was like a board that said you can come back flexibly after I just had a baby. You can take your maternity leave, and by the way, just a shout out to organisations, Renewable UK paid my maternity leave even though I was leaving to go to Energy UK. That changed my life. I couldn't have done, I wouldn't be a chief exec as a woman with a baby if that hadn't happened. So big thank you. I can see the chief exec of UK over there. So thanks for that, by the way. Thank you very much. So some of these things, like having really properly inclusive practices that you consult on with your teams and like really get the voices of your organisation involved in, really key. But lastly, it's behaviour. So again, we've talked a lot about women and vulnerable people and diverse people and including them, but it's also about the people that hold power stepping aside. That includes white women, by the way. Yes. But my previous bosses have all been men, but they got out of the way so that I could have my career, and they were willing to let me do things very differently to how they would and take the risk. And it was a risk to them because it was different how the organisation thought, you know, someone in my job should behave. So I think you've got to have that partnership and people who hold power, understanding why people that don't have a voice need to have a voice and why it might benefit them to do it. Yeah, that's my hot take on what we need to do. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I completely agree with you. I think, you know, so we're at a point where the balance is very much swung in one direction. That's what we've all just been discussing, whether you're looking at gender or whether you're looking at other minorities and society in general. So, as I said at the start, there just have to be a way of redressing that slightly. And as you say, Emma, I think that does mean people stepping aside in order to recognise the value of having that diversity at the table. So I think if there's one thing that our listeners could do, it would be to really ask themselves, you know, could I be giving this opportunity to a more diverse voice in my company? should I be actually advocating for other people, my peers, to do the same? And can I advocate to my elected officials as well to make sure that, you know, events that we're both running together or that we're participating in are also diverse? And I think that is the way that we try and drive this systemic change, in the same way that we've done in many other areas and with the climate movement in general.
Yeah, I think that's important. If you're in senior leadership and you watch this or you ever see it, I think that matters, whatever, you know, your background, because you've got to make sure you bring the next generation of diverse voices through. And also you're likely to probably be a bit older anyway. So I think so I get lots of speaking events because I'm a woman, and I don't mind that at all. I think that's really important, but I'm very conscious that I need to make space for my team coming up to have that room too.
Yes.
And so it's not just about, you know, blokes stepping aside for women. It's about leadership, is about sharing your platform with people with a different point of view. Yeah.
And I think the next generation are really
Terrifying.
holding, you know, they're holding us to account on so many issues across the board, whether it's climate change, whether it's diversity, whether it's flexible working policies. But I think that's the power that you also hold when you choose where you want to work, and work is such a large part of your life. It's something that I've been speaking about on panels post-pandemic. It's the employee sort of employer relationship that we've seen across every single host of sector under the sun. It has been so intimate during the pandemic that everything that's gone on, you've really started to understand your employees, and employees have understand the power that they have to change things within a business. And CEOs and COOs, CFOs are sitting up and listening, whether that's why are we using plastic cups to why does our board look like this, or why do we have these practices? Can we just continue doing flexible working? Novel concept, right? Like so many businesses before thought, you know, no one's going to work. We won't know what everyone is doing. And actually people are working harder.
Better.
Exactly. Than ever before. So there's this unique and quite exciting opportunity, you know, including in the energy transition, that we can stop doing things how we've done them before. It's a once in a lifetime opportunity to do that. And whether you can take that opportunity now and really realise it, it is going to make a difference to what's happening over there across the river. But also the intersectionality point that isn't spoken about as much during COP, but hugely important as well. Thinking about the LGBTQ plus community, thinking about gender as well, and ethnicity. We're learning a lot from what's happened in the gender movement. But just because, you know, something else you have to focus on, it doesn't matter that the gender point has gone away. No, we're still not performing as well, and it's sort of looking at it through bifocal lenses, that you have to do everything at once. And we at the CBI are really passionate about the diversity of voices. So when we're putting together our panels, etc., we were holding ourselves to account, and we're having those conversations actually. So when we're approaching a business for any of the events that you would have seen us putting on, we've said, actually, we would actually like, you know, her to speak, or him from this background, because we think they're going to bring this different point of view. But a lot of people are really scared about having those conversations to begin with. But
even asking the question is scary, isn't it?
Even asking the question is really,
for some people,
difficult. But it's important to start that. So for us, it's part of that movement to say, actually, wait a second, we found all of these great women to speak on our events. I'm in a position where we're doing an event on Transport Day After, and actually we have, you know, more women joining, or one on nature and biodiversity, you know, and it just happened. We didn't even intend for it to be that way, but just great women on these subject topics, or people from different backgrounds. And it's shocking. You just need to ask the question, and it's also empowering for me. So I hold our executive team to account every morning on the train. We're talking when we come into the blue zone with our CEO Tony Danke. You know, he's asking, you know, what do you feel, what's happening? So it's about having those conversations and enabling one another. So for me, you know, upwards as well as downwards, because you know, my team challenge me all the time, and I love that.
I was going to say that I think that's it, isn't it? It's about listening to the answer as well as asking the question. That's what I found hardest with some of my colleagues who are younger, is to be open enough to the answer, even if it's a really challenging one that you might not initially agree with, or that you can get very defensive about. I've really had to control my defensive nature and go, okay, well maybe you've got a point, you know, and that then makes a difference to the actions that I then take, and would also keep people within the organisation. Because that's the other thing that we found as a very white organisation in WWF UK that we need to change, is that people might come in but then they'll leave unless they're being listened to and heard. And some of the most progressive companies and organisations that are genuinely changing are changing because they're listening to the answers that come in and then doing something about it rather than just...
Yeah, it's the tip over from diversity into proper inclusion, and I'm struck that when you get so I talk about the experience of being a woman in the energy sector because that's been my experience, but I recognise that the intersectionality point and that alienation feeling goes much broader than my experience. In lots of ways I'm very privileged because, you know, white, powerful, all of those things, but it's when you explain to someone who's powerful in the majority what it feels like to walk into a room and when you're the only one, and just even if you're there and you've been chosen to be there and you're respected and everything else has gone well for you, just how difficult it can be not to have people who've lived your experience who can relate to the things. They're saying we've all made a joke about not having microphones that are closed. It can be that simple.
Yeah,
like
it means
really
you don't have to go to the toilet and miss put the mic in and miss all the important conversations that happen just before a panel. But I mean, that's the sort of thing that does have impact. When I think, I mean, another example from my days on the development side, working in India on access to water and sanitation, I remember very, very distinctly meeting a group of all male civil servants in a massive state, I think it was Karnataka, you know, trying to get water and sanitation to millions of people in that state. And I think what was striking there was not that the technical solutions weren't important. All of the technology, I mean, we're talking about basic toilets and access to water. Water's slightly more technologically important, but just digging a hole is not actually a technology. It's not. But and learning how to deal with it. But in that situation, what you needed there was more civil servants and more diversity of civil servants. So the solution there was not technological. If you'd had a group of women around that table, they would have come up with that solution and said, look, we just need to work together. We need more civil servants. But I was never going to be able to run a campaign that was like, more civil servants now, more women civil servants. But that's it's a tough sell, but technology is an easier sell. But these sorts of solutions will have much more impact and more sustainably over a longer period of time and actually be cheaper to implement as well.
I mean, your point on diversity and inclusion, the D&I bracket, you know, the saying that goes round is, you know, diversity is being asked to the party, inclusion is being, you know, invited to, you know, to dance and be part of that. And that is, you know, part when you think about what's happening over the course of these 2 weeks, not just being invited to just be a bystander, right?
Yeah.
Because it's quite overwhelming, as I mentioned, first COP, so you don't know what's coming at you. So it's about getting those meetings in the diary, people listening to those voices, the stories. That is the definition of inclusion, where going to the point of, you know, when you're being asked those questions, listening, digesting and adapting policy as a result.
And I know Becca wants to come in, but on the, you know, where we did that well, for once it felt like, so we were at Paris and I remind people all the time that the 1.5 degree target is because the small island nations were there and other, you know, vulnerable groups were pushing that target because they understood what the impacts already are on vulnerable people and places. And I think from a technocratic point of view, from industry's point of view, from, you know, the wider economy's point of view, obviously that's an incredibly difficult thing to achieve. We knew that when we were campaigning for it. But there's often an accidental callousness when people say that out loud, because what they're talking about is the lives of vulnerable people in groups that never reported on, and in particular within that women and girls who, as we've said, are often the ones most impacted. So I think there's there was massive success at Paris in those voices being heard and it being properly included in the negotiation text. And I think for this week, where we've got ambition on the agenda again, we need to realise that when we're talking about closing the gap to 1.5 degrees, we're talking about basically it's a representation issue there, because the people most impacted by a failure to do that will be women and girls and other vulnerable groups. And we don't often say that out loud. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing I keep thinking about this week, and I'm not sure that I've got a specific answer to this, but we're all sitting here in the UK, part of the UK industry, and we're looking out at the rest of the world, and our cultural norms and what's okay in our kind of business settings is not necessarily okay in other countries. And I think when we're looking at gender and inclusion, that the same is true. There's different parameters according to where you are in the world.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes that then kind of almost perpetuates the sort of male CEO being at the forefront of the conversation, because ultimately what's at stake and what you're trying to negotiate with the other side does come kind of back to the cultural norms of what you're used to dealing with. So it's a really tricky one. I think we have to, in many things, we have to get our own house in order first, like in the wider climate negotiation sphere. We can't be kind of leaders in this space unless we are walking the talk. But for that kind of wider question, I think I still, from an industry point of view, I'm not sure how we get there on that one yet,
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point, because when we talk to businesses, it's also, you develop a technology here, but if you want to have an impact globally, you really have to embed yourselves in the communities to explain what is happening. Solar, for instance, if I think about my family back home in India, when they think about climate change, or where they think I am these 2 weeks, is explaining to them it's the air quality point that they know tangibly. It's the air quality, it's the rain that they feel. But culturally, when you translate, all the texts obviously in English, for instance, different words have different meanings. And yourselves as seasoned COP goers, I'm here to sort of admire, all of the work that you've done to pave the way for individuals like me in the next generation to take this baton on. But that does translate differently into the meaning. So what net zero means, that's why it's so important, actually. How do you take this back home and say, okay, for our society, our country, this is what it looks like? Because actually, take transportation, for instance. I keep on laughing because I drove here from the south of England. I've recently acquired an EV, and I thought, the journey for 9 hours was really long to get here. Whereas talking to my family back in India, that's just a standard journey.
Normal,
but you can't afford to buy an EV for that. There wouldn't be charging infrastructure, etc. So, understanding how do you translate some of the actions that we are asking to do on a global level for different cultures and society. It's completely different. And that's a huge hurdle to overcome.
I saw a video this morning of a Kenyan woman, 8 months pregnant, with her son walking to collect water, and they were talking about the increased drought in Kenya and in other parts of Africa, and therefore the climate impacts. But she was having to walk further and further every day to get water at like 4 hours, and she's 8 months pregnant. And just having been pregnant, all I wanted to do when I was 8 months pregnant is lie on the floor. I can't I can't process that kind of world. But you're right, sometimes it feels like the conversations we have in these spaces are so far removed from the reality of how a lot of ordinary people are living. This is feeling quite depressing, and rightly good. I hope people watching are moved. But I wondered if to finish, given I promised I'd keep you all for half an hour, I'm already over that, is to think about what's inspired you, or what you've seen in this experience that's been good, because we've talked a lot about what's left to do. And just before we do that as a close, this is an industry focused event, so we should note that GWEC and the CBI and Energy UK and our UK and probably WWF2 all have initiatives focused at improving the diversity in the sector. Energy UK signed up to the BBC's 50/50 initiative, where we promise that you'll only ever see 50-50 gender split on all of our public communications, doing quite well here. But that, you know, and we've got other programs too, including a diversity directory where you can find great speakers. And I know that IUK have got their Switch program, and again, a great speakers list there of women, and it's a focus for them too. And then I'll just give you a chance to plug, and then we'll come to the last question. The GWEC have got a huge program too.
So we've got a fantastic program which is called Women in Wind, and it's a completely global program. It's about the next generation, not just of kind of engineers and women doing amazing work on the renewables transition in their country, but also about giving them a platform to inspire other women globally who might look like them or sound like them to get involved in the industry. We've had some super successful spokespeople who've been appearing also in the official COP communications and talking about why it's so important for them to tackle climate change in their country. So that's my plug. Check out Women in Wind.
And the CBI, I know, has got kind of diversity initiatives too.
Yeah, diversity and inclusion at the heart of all of the work that we do at the CBI and one of our core policy strands. But from one area that I'm really passionate about is our Change the Race Ratio campaign. So that's all about improving diversity of voices across the business community, similar to sort of the 30% club that's been created for women. But we're mobilising the business community, led by our President, Lord Curran Billamoria. So that's a great initiative and best practice sharing with businesses, but also how do you develop the pipeline of talent element as well. So yeah, for anyone that wants to engage, and that also feeds into the work, like I mentioned, that we're doing across all of our events. For instance, at COP as well, is how do you make sure those range of voices are there present in any event that we do.
In fact, we need to pick up with UK after all this is done about green jobs and how we get there and making sure those are diverse in future, because we're all wrestling that challenge in industry. Right, so to finish, what things have you seen or heard or people have inspired you over the last 2 weeks? What gives you kind of hope in this space? So if you have to go beyond the last 2 weeks to find it, fair enough. But let's start with you, Kate.
Well, I'm really hopeful by a number of things. One thing is that for the first time, it really feels that nature and climate are coming closer together at this COP, and as a result, you know, before I came to work at WWF, I didn't really know there was a difference. You know, nature and climate and nature, they're exactly the same thing. And it's important that that continues, because without nature, we can't fight climate and vice versa, or climate change. The thing, though, that I have a sort of simultaneous contradictory feeling at COP. One, which is a feeling of frustration. I'll come to the positive in a minute, because I'm like, well, you know, if you're a world leader in this room, you're sitting in the room, you have the power to end investment in fossil fuels. Why wouldn't you just do it? That's a sort of my sense of frustration. And then on the other side, huge positivity that actually since Paris, a lot has actually happened, and that an imperfect international process has increased ambition, has reduced the likely temperature change, albeit not nearly fast enough, particularly when it comes to 2030. So I'm holding those two contradictory positions in my head, and but you know, in the end, I'm a person that would work within the system, because I don't think we've got the time or the energy as to throw it all up in the air and start again. So I come away feeling hopeful that the increase and diversity of voices that you can see in this summit, albeit not perfect, it's an imperfect system, but it is a system that is working, and I think and I believe that that's going to continue in the years to come. We've got no other choice, to be honest.
Yeah, that is that's my reaction to that. Tanya.
So firstly, I think from speaking to lots of people, those random conversations that I keep on pulling people up on, I feel internationally the argument on science seems to be really won. You can reflect on that better than me, but it feels like there is a consensus around that. Previously, everyone used to be, the science question mark, is this really happening? I feel across the global north and global south, you know, there is an agreement on that. So that gives me a lot of hope going forwards. Secondly, that business has really turned up. My emails are inundated with people saying, you know, we want to do more. What comes next? How can we actually make this a decade for delivery? And I think in previous COPs, you really haven't had as much business engagement. And I think we've done really well as a UK community to bring business here. Our challenge and my challenge taking this on for British industry is making sure that we continue that momentum in a positive way. So everything that's come out on finance, everything that's come out on reporting, and how can we lead from the front. And then thirdly, for me, it's the youth and the public empowerment bit is really exciting for me, because it shows that there is, you know, a next generation of individuals who I'll get to meet, and hopefully they'll hold me to account as I grow through my career. But I've already got that going, so that actually makes me really excited that we will make an impact actually. And like you say, it's going to be from, you know, the inside as well. I'm very passionate about that and holding, you know, governments to account. So I think that we've actually encouraged the next generation to say, look, there's this huge opportunity and you can be part of this. So yeah, I think I've opened myself to challenge now to anyone that wants to challenge me, but do that, because we need more young people engaging in this.
Yep. And Becca?
Yeah, some excellent points there from Tanya, but I think, I mean, obviously, I really believe in our industry and the industry that we have here. And what I've been really heartened by over the last week is just the amount of engagement we've had from different government delegations, a real desire not just to commit to kind of long-term targets, but to get started, to do the heavy lifting and really graft and work towards 2030 in partnership with the renewable sector and in partnership with industry. And for me, that's just so exciting. It's so far away from where we were even a few years ago. And when we're talking about the countries that are kind of engaging in this conversation, it really is the countries who still need to grow their energy demand because of growing population numbers. It's countries that were until very recently looking at still investing in new coal-fired power stations. So that is a seismic shift, and that gives me so much hope for the future.
And I guess I'll finish. I've really stitched myself up by being the last person because those are all really great. Look, so I agree. If I had to kind of map the three boxes of change, I think the science argument is one, and that's been one because ordinary people can look out of the window now wherever they are in the world and feel the impacts of climate change, and they're worried about their loved ones. So there's that kind of wider public anger, worry, now very visible in politicians and people too, so they feel it as well, and it aligns with what the scientists said would happen. So I think the science argument is one. The thing that I've really enjoyed about this COP versus other COPs I've been to where I've been in civil society, and I don't think it's just because I've drunk the Kool-Aid from now being in industry, I think it's a genuinely exciting time in the business community where in many cases businesses are now ahead of where their government delegations are, and if we can be at all useful in saying to governments, look, we want this, we think it's the future economy, we think it's going to be different, that's great. And just on that note, there's a thing that I read over the last couple of weeks about the world of work and how we need to change to build in more voices that keeps making me laugh, and it's the old 40-hour working week and the way that we did business before, just in terms of ways of working, let alone climate change, only worked because everyone had a wife back home. and I think there just feels like on every front, because of the pandemic and because of this new economic opportunity, that business is changing. And I have definitely enjoyed as a representative of industry that they give me considerable free license to do this job very differently than any other chief exec of Energy UK would have done. So that's the business bit. The bit that I think we still need to work at and close the gap on is the moral mission, and talking about the wider set of values and making people understand how big this opportunity and challenge is. And there are three things I guess I've seen on that I recommend to anyone watching. The first is Maya Rose Craig, who's Bird Girl, and the kind of young and ethnic minority activists who are trying to bring more diverse voices to the nature and climate movement, but also be here at COP. She was on stage yesterday with a whole group of them and Emma Watson, and you can find the clip, but she talks about the need to mess with the system, Becca, and just do things differently. And she's so eloquent. It's astonishing at 19, so she really moved me. And the second thing that I've seen in COP and people speaking is the Prime Minister of Barbados. And she just absolutely smashed her leader speech out of the park. But again, that call for a moral mission, bringing 1.5 degrees back to being something that's more about, more than just the economic transition, to being about her people. She was extraordinary, I thought. And then lastly, because we're talking about climate change, I thought Attenborough's opening speech was amazing, but particularly that frame and that laid down challenge of, in a value system over the last kind of generation, we've destroyed the nature and as a consequence our wider economy and the kind of social fabric feels like it's crumbling too, but there's every opportunity to fix it in our lifetimes. And I thought for someone looking back at that change in his 90s, he clearly sees, not just because of the youth activists, but also the change in business and this groundswell of potential coming forward that we have to, as you said, have to capitalise on. So yeah, there's been lots of good stuff in amongst the things that have been doing our heads in, and I suppose that's a nice place to finish. Thank you so much, everyone. Again, the sisterhood is real, and I know that because I basically phoned all of you over the last 48 hours and said, can you come and save me from doing a speech? And if there's anything that indicates a change in working culture is that none of you threw me under the bus, which is probably what was happened back in the day, and all of you have kind of stepped in to help me out. And it's been a really lovely and wide-ranging panel, and hopefully great for the audience. And we've got other events coming up across the rest of the week in the Transition Hub, so do tune in. Of course, if you're watching this live, well done, but we can also watch it back online and you'll be able to see clips from this on social media too. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.